Hello, I'm Dan Lynch, and you can join me and Simon Phipps as we talk to Francis Irving, the CEO of ScraperWiki, up next on Floss Weekly.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Floss Weekly is provided by Cachefly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Floss Weekly, episode 185, recorded Wednesday the 5th of October, 2011. ScraperWiki. This episode of Floss Weekly is brought to you by Netflix. Watch thousands of TV episodes and movies direct on your PC, Mac, iPad, phone, or TV. All streamed directly to you, saving you time, money, and hassle. For your free 30-day trial, go to netflix.com/twit. Hello and welcome to another episode of Floss Weekly, the show about free Libre open source software. You may be able to tell by now that I'm not Randall Schwartz. I'm also not Aaron Newcomb. My name's Dan Lynch, and I'm here guest hosting this week while Randall's away on another cruise. And I'm pleased to say that I'm joined, by another Brit, in fact. It's a British takeover this week with Simon Phipps. Simon, how are you doing?
Very well, thank you. I was actually on the show last week. Maybe this is a British takeover. I don't know.
Well, it could well be, yeah. I mean, we've even got a British guest today in the form of a friend of mine, actually, from Liverpool, Francis Irving, who is the CEO of ScraperWiki. And ScraperWiki is a kind of central resource for people to build tools, scrapers, as you might guess, to build scrapers to get data from government websites and any other kind of website, really, and build it into a structured form that can be reused and so on. So that's going to be interesting to talk about. So, any thoughts on that before we get into it, Simon?
Well, I took a look at the ScraperWiki site when you send out the details of the program, and I found it very interesting. I also particularly noticed that Francis has been involved in lots of activist programming for things like the My Society site, for They Work For You, for Fix My Street, and a whole load of other initiatives that will be familiar to British hackers and geeks, but maybe won't be so familiar to the rest of the audience. So it will be interesting to dig into those for people.
Excellent. Yeah, it sounds very good. And before we do that, I just need to take a quick moment to tell you about our sponsor this show. This episode of Floss Weekly is brought to you by Netflix. Netflix streams thousands of TV episodes and movies direct to you instantly, which means you can save time, money, and hassle. There are several easy ways to instantly access streaming movies and TV shows with Netflix. You can use your Mac, PC. I believe you can even use Linux now. They're talking about a Linux client, which sounds good to me. And you can use the iPad and other kind of tablets. You can get it on your phone, iPhone, or some Android phones as well. If you have a gaming console, such as the Xbox 360, PS3, or Nintendo Wii, you can watch it on your TV right through that, or you can use a Roku box, which I know Randall actually does, and he's been very happy with it. So with Netflix, you can watch movies and TV shows instantly using any of these devices, and you can begin watching a movie on one device and then continue finishing off watching it on another device, which sounds really good if you're a person like me who kind of starts a film and then the phone rings and then you have to move and do it somewhere else. That sounds very useful. And whichever way you choose to access Netflix, you can watch as many movies or TV shows as you want as part of your monthly subscription, and you can cancel at any time. And we have a special offer at the moment to try Netflix right now for 30 days free. If you go to netflix.com/twit, you can do that there, and be sure to use that URL, netflix.com/twit. And we thank Netflix for their support of Twit. Right then, so should we go ahead and bring on our guest? Francis Irving, who is the CEO of ScraperWiki. Francis, welcome to the show.
Hello there. How are you doing?
I'm good. And Randall usually starts the interviews by asking people where they're calling from. But in our case, it's probably not worth me doing that because you're actually calling from Liverpool and only a few hundred yards away from where I am right now. So that's going to be interesting. So I suppose, how's the weather 500 yards over there? Is it any better?
It's actually quite nice. It's not raining today. And it's really nice. The video conferencing is so good now that you prefer to talk to me like this rather than meeting personally.
Yeah. It's because I haven't got two cameras, really. And it would have been difficult for us to squeeze onto one onto one camera. So I gave a brief kind of overview, intro to ScraperWiki at the start of the show, but can you start off by giving us a kind of an outline of what ScraperWiki is and what it does?
Yeah, so ScraperWiki is a place where you can write scripts that do things like scrape data and analyze it, and you can share these with other people and reuse them across the internet. So think a kind of something like YouTube or Google Docs, only for doing wrangling with data.
Cool.
Maybe,
sorry, yeah, go on.
Yeah, the best way to sort of explain it is probably give an example from its history, which is it came from this, as you know, I worked for My Society, and I've been involved a lot in these public data projects which involve making bits of government more usable for people. And quite early on, we did a lot of screen scraping for that. So, for example, Julian, who's the CTO of ScraperWiki now, scraped the Parliament website in order to build a site that's called theyworkforyou.com that tells you about things like how your MP voted and lets you find out about them. And we found that maintaining these scrapers is quite hard, and also sourcing enough of them is quite hard over time. It's easy to knock one off to start with, but then people tend to lose them and not maintain them. So part of the history of it is to make that a better process.
Excellent. And how long has the project been running for now, then?
It's been up for about 1.5 years now. And we've got lots of interesting examples. If you go and have a look at ScraperWiki.com, and you can see there's some featured ones on the front page. You can see the kinds of things that people are doing with it. Like turning basically the unstructured web into structured data that you can then do more interesting things with.
Okay, so the kind of core of the problem, I suppose I'll call it, is that a lot of, well, in this country, in the UK, a lot of people will be listening in other countries. We have a thing called freedom of information, the Freedom of Information Act, which means that the government have to legally oblige to release certain pieces of information. And depending on your perspective, some people would say they make this hard deliberately, make it hard to analyze this data deliberately because they don't really want to release it. I suppose that's a matter of opinion. But so a lot of the data will be kind of published in one big block of text, which is no use, and so on. So this is what ScraperWiki helps with, isn't it? It helps you structure that data and so on.
Yeah, so at its simplest, it's just to turn it into a spreadsheet so someone non-technical can do something with it in Excel. And if it's more complicated, it makes an API so you can make applications and do things like that. So the raw technology behind ScraperWiki is exactly all the open source tools that people use to do this kind of thing. So all we're doing is making a product, making it more visible and easy to use, things that people do anyway, like use libraries like NoCodeGiri in Ruby or things like LXML in Python. We make those accessible from a browser and scheduled to run in the cloud. So you can use these tools, then become more accessible and more kind of visible. People tend to do them on their own. They'll have their own shell account somewhere and write a script and put it in a cron job, and then store the data in various different ways. Whereas if you do all that on ScraperWiki, then it becomes in a standard format that other people can easily see. You get a page for your scraper. You can get other people to help you maintain your scraper, because it is indeed by default a wiki, just like the name says.
Okay, yeah, because I was curious how the scraper and the wiki kind of fit together. So, it's a collection in a wiki of different scrapers that people can collaborate on and so on.
Yeah. And it is, as you say, about making use of government data, but also increasingly corporate data, which is opened up, but is hard to do anything with. And it's actually a bit more than that. It's philosophically, when you get some data from someone, you have to some extent, you have to work at it with code in order to put it in a form that you need, because almost by definition, what you want to do with it is different from the person who made it and why they reproduced it in that way. And if you're not doing something different, then you're probably not doing something new. So from the point of view of a journalist, we get lots of, we're very popular with journalists. You want to find things in the data that the person who made the data didn't want you to find. And to do that, you have to work with it on your own terms. So kind of one of our philosophers is scraping isn't just a horrible thing we have to do at the moment for the next 10 years. It's actually just the first part of working with data and doing proper analysis on data that's analytical, and linking data in a way that you want to link it and refining it in a way that you want to refine it.
Okay, then. So, I mean, we have quite a technical audience, so I probably don't need to explain this to most of them, but I think we should probably explain quickly what a scraper actually is. So you're doing screen scraping in this case, in most cases, which is kind of taking a block of text or whatever and breaking it up into smaller bits. Can you explain that a little bit for everyone?
So the very, very basic is reading a web page. So literally doing an HTTP request, just like a web browser would do, downloading a web page, and then writing some heuristics, really, like a set of rules that roughly work for that specific page, and pull out data from it. So it's very, very common nowadays. Now HTML is more used and better used. You can do it with CSS selectors. So these are the same things that people use to set up the design of a web page in a style sheet. You can use the same selectors to pull data out. And that's kind of coding, because there's this linguistic element of saying what selects you use and what the nesting rules are. But then you also will have to do more processing with the data. So you might want to pass a date and convert it from being a human-readable date into a machine-readable date that you can actually then query with. And you might want to link up to another data set and connect, create an identifier from something that in the original data doesn't have an identifier. So it's really using code to encode some heuristics that change the format of data.
Okay, and do the scrapers break often? Because I imagine, you know, people move things around on web pages, they redesign their stuff. Is that a problem for you guys?
They do, and one of the good things about ScraperWiki is you can keep track of that, because you get a dashboard that shows you which of your scrapers are broken, and it can email the people who are contributing to it to tell them when it's broken. So there's a kind of, rather than what tends to happen is you tend to just you set it up on a cron job and you get lots of cron spam. You don't really want to deal with more email cron spam, and ScraperWiki breaks that apart by making it so that when it goes wrong, that's a kind of public information that's gone wrong. So maybe someone else will come along and fix it for you rather than you having to do it.
No, that's very cool. We've actually we've got some questions from the IRC channel, people who are watching and listening right now. So we've got a question. We've got a question from Sands of Mars, who says they're interested in the potential for the use of this inside corporations, and I think that's something that you kind of referenced a little bit there. They're saying as a business application. Is that something that you're looking into?
Absolutely. So we've in fact just launched in the beta version at the moment a vault feature, which lets people write scrapers that live inside a private vault. So the code is no longer visible. So it's no longer, the scrapers themselves are no longer open source, even though the platform still is. And the people can pay for hosting to have these private scrapers hosted. So that's for cases where you want to. So sometimes it might be you want to write some quite expensive scrapers that might take a lot of time and then do something else with the data that you don't want to share. But sometimes it might be that you can't share it because you have to use a password or a login in order to get the data that you're scraping. So that's kind of our first step towards corporate use. What I'd like to see later on, maybe in our roadmap, maybe in a year's time, year and a half, would be to have a firewall install of ScraperWiki, so you could use it to, just like you might buy a Google search appliance to search your intranet, you might buy a ScraperWiki install to get people to keep their data wrangling in one place within a corporation and organize it. So this is the kind of category of software that ScraperWiki is called a data hub, and it's a new category, much like no one had heard of web content management systems in the sort of early 1990s. But by 2000, that was the really exciting area, was what content management systems going to win, which ones are important. And we think that there's a lot of opportunity for collaborating on data and on processing of data, refining of data, visualization of data on the web, and it's not been done very well yet. There are lots of people trying to do it and having some success, but it's as the data explodes more and more, there's this from the open source point of view, it's this move from talking about open source code to also talking about open data and how they two relate.
So we have a quick follow-up from Sands of Mars, who was in the chat room there, who wants to know if there's a REST interface for the wiki. I'm not sure how that quite relates to the other question, but that was the other thing they wanted to know about.
So there's a web API for getting your data out. So when you've written a scraper, you get, if you do on each scraper page, there's a button to get to the API for that scraper, and that actually has an SQL-based web API, so you can literally put SQL queries in the URL to get your data out. So if you want to limit it or sort it or select it in a certain way, that's really easy to do. There is also an API for getting data out of the site, so information about scrapers. What we don't specifically have yet is a documented API for editing the code, if that's what he means, but it's something I would love to happen. So that would be, often people want to do things like maybe integrate it with an editor, so maybe edit from Emacs directly into ScraperWiki, and we don't have a documented API for that, although of course it's all just post requests. The JavaScript, so the code at the moment you write in CodeMirror in an editor and in your browser, And that is done in such a way that when you save it, it obviously submits the save code with a post request. So you could, in theory, call that as if it was an API if you wanted to.
So, Francis, I'm fascinated to see that you've been involved in My Society, which is one of my favorite organizations. I've got a very soft spot for the Open Rights Group in the UK, which is it's kind of Europe's equivalent of the Electronic Frontier Foundation for our American viewers and listeners. And you've been involved in My Society. Now, that will only be familiar to geeks in the UK. Would you like to explain a little bit about what that is? Because I think that's one of your big motivations behind ScraperWiki as well.
What geeks in the US might be familiar with is the Sunlight Foundation, which is a US that watches the House of Representatives and the Congress, and they were inspired by My Society. So that was a site called They Work For You that My Society made, which was the first group of activists in the world to scrape a parliament and then make it more usable for citizens. So there's a kind of link between, so what I did at My Society was this trying to make government more usable and having little hacks on top of government to use kind of the openness of the web to try and make government more open and to make it easier to use. And ScraperWiki is partly about commoditizing that and making it easier for people to do that kind of hack on top of data that governments have.
Okay, so the code that you used in ScraperWiki, was that the code that you created for theyworkforyou.com?
It's not the actual same code, but the kind of things we learned from doing it are very much embedded in ScraperWiki. So things we discovered were interesting about how data is gathered and reused.
So I'm a big fan of They Work For You. Again, for our American viewers and listeners and for folks elsewhere in the world, They Work For You is a website that lets you subscribe to your member of parliament, for your Congress critter, and get an RSS feed or email alerts whenever they say something. And that's all done by scraping as well, is it, Francis?
It is all done by scraping, and it as well as getting things like that, it gets structured data, such as the voting record, so we know exactly how they voted and can create very nice one-sentence visualization saying this MP voted for or against invading Iraq. And those are kind of, you can think of them as sort of semi-automated journalism, where if you don't have enough money to pay investigative journalists to special custom write you a story, you can make a website that goes and uses open data and scraping to create those stories for you.
And that's now gone a lot further into crowdsourcing some of the work. For example, you've got the visitors to the site annotating the videos that are put up by the BBC Parliament channel.
Yeah, there's a bunch of interesting crowdsourced stuff in the My Society website. So we had a trouble that we wanted to show video on the site because obviously people like watching their MPs speaking and it can be more fun than reading them. So we needed to link up the video feed with the text, which we get from the transcript of Hansard, it's called, which is the parliamentary transcript. And to do that, we have a game you play where you can basically watch, and we have a whole load of people who love doing this, they're very competitive about it. They watch parliamentary video, and when it gets to a certain point where a certain piece of text is just about to be said, they hit a big button to say, this piece of text matches against this piece of video. And that means that we can then have let you play the video and it go through it all in order. And there are one of the interesting things about the crowd here is where you get someone to do something selfishly that adds to a selfless whole. So another example of that, there's a site called Fix My Street, which My Society created, which is for reporting things like potholes and abandoned cars. And the similar version of it, there's an Open 311 movement in America, and a thing called See-Click-Fix, which has come from the kind of Fix My Street idea. And the good thing about Fix My Street is once you've reported a problem, rather than it being buried in some secret hidden IT system inside a bit of government, it becomes a piece of open data that then anyone can see the problem's being reported, they can see patterns in the problem reporting, they can see, like a bug tracker, it's like a kind of open bug tracker. So I think, a lot of the ideas in this area are things which, with hindsight, the open source movement's like very world leading on, but no one really realized at the time that those were the things that could be used in so many other areas. So literally having an open bug tracker is like really radical and started out with the open source movement. And likewise, other bits, any other ticketing system in the world can be opened up in the same way. And gradually they will be. And it's quite exciting how much there is still to play out on the internet as we move sort of to the next phase.
Right. So you've mentioned they work for you, and you've mentioned Fix My Street. Do you want us to tell us about What Do They Know, the Freedom of Information aggregator?
Yeah, so What Do They Know is another of these hacks on top of government, where the idea is anyone can make a freedom of information request in most countries in the world now, in most sort of developed countries in the world now, and send a letter saying, I want this particular document, I want this contract between this agency and another one, and then the agency has to send it to you with certain exceptions. And the clever trick we realised is actually you don't want it to just be hidden in your email box. When you get the document back, you want to be able to share it with other people. You don't mind other people being able to get access to it. And there's no point requesting it multiple times. So we built a kind of what turned out to be basically a public email client, where you can send an email in public to the authority, and then they just reply normally as if they're replying to an email from you, which is in fact what they are doing. But we intercept it via a magic email address and then republish it, which is, so similarly to the way Fix My Street makes problem reports open, this makes government documents open. And what's good about it is the data it releases is the data that someone actually wanted. So there's an activist, a journalist, someone in a business who wanted this data. So it tends to be naturally slightly more interesting than if you just get the data that gets released proactively by civil servants. And quite often, in fact, we scrape it as well. So people will then take complicated Excel files or bits of data in text that's come out via What Do They Know, and then feed it into ScraperWiki so they can do some more things with it after that.
Right. And is there any similar system for handling freedom of information replies that come back as paper? Because a friend of mine over in the Netherlands runs a Big Wobber over there, which is the equivalent of the Freedom of Information Act. And he tends to get all of his replies as huge stacks of photocopied documents.
So first of all, I would recommend doing the forceful thing of trying to make them not do that. So in the UK, we were really worried about this when we launched What Do They Know, and we had plans to have like a scanning centre at a university where we would scan in incoming documents. But it turned out that if we don't give a postal address, so we don't even tell the authority a postal address, we just give them an email. So often they'll just reply to email. And then if they say, no, I want a postal address, you go, well, why do you want one? Haven't you got a scanner? Can't you scan it in and send it to me? And we even have Julian here once embarrassed a local authority by going, oh, so you haven't got a scanner? Well, I'll post you a scanner. And he offered to send them, pay 30 quid and send them a scanner if they scan it in. And he was so embarrassed that they scanned it in anyway. Didn't found what they were doing. So first of all, put pressure on, just embarrass them with the media. So the media love that kind of story. Like, authority can't, not paperless, they can't even send an electronic response to a request. If that all fails, you can do what the guys at Muckrock are doing. So Muckrock is a US site that's very similar to What Do They Know, which lets you make FOI requests. And you often have to pay to do it through them because the US agencies are more often charge a fee. But they will also, as part of the fee you pay to make the request, they scan it in for you. And they have a centre with a postal address with literally employ people who scan in the documents and put them on the web for you. So if you're really stuck, the Dutch people could go that way. And I should at this point explain from an open source point of view, What Do They Know is really interesting right now. There's a project called Alaviteli, which is spelled Alaveteli. It's actually the town in Sweden where freedom of information was invented back in the 18th century. And Alaviteli is the source code behind What Do They Know, but made more general, so it can be used for other sites. And there's a whole bunch of sites now coming out by different countries. The first one of those is for the European Union. It's called asktheeu.org. But you can now it's becoming more of its own kind of proper open source project where it's getting contributions from different installs in different countries. So if you want to use that code, then it's now much easier to use than it's ever been. There's a great person called Seb Bacon who's doing lots of the coding at My Society to make that happen. So I would have a look for Alaviteli and join their mailing list if someone wants to bring this idea to their own place.
So how much of the work that you've done on these activism, it's kind of practical hacking activism. How much of this work has been able to extend beyond the UK to produce change?
Oh, it gets copied loads, which is one of the rewarding things. So people, like I said earlier, the Sunlight Foundation were very inspired by what they saw we were doing in Parliament. So before that, there was a problem in the US of these kinds of activists being very partisan. So they would try and use these kinds of hacks to partisan advantage. And that doesn't work as well, because actually people expect sort of the same integrity as a really good journalist. They expect non-partisanship and like factualness of these kinds of resources. So just in terms of conceptually, it's been copied and has led lots of the kind of examples that have come from my society have led to this whole open government movement and the open data movement that ScraperWiki is part of making more solid and more kind of useful. That's the first thing. The second thing is in terms of code, we've had less success. There's a really interesting problem actually, which I should talk about because it's I think one of the big problems with open source right now, which is that we haven't really moved on from this question of how do we clone a desktop that's as good as Microsoft's desktop to the question of how do we deal with web services. So the My Society site and ScraperWiki indeed are licensed with the Afiro GPL because there's this thing, there'd be no point using the GPL because then with a web service, if it was GPL, someone could just host it with a fork and not have to give away the code anyway. So you may as well license it with a BSD license. So there's this interesting transition to the web happening, and one of the problems is getting contributions to web services, like getting code contributions to them. And for ones which people install themselves, like WordPress, that happens relatively naturally because there are enough people who have their own WordPress installed that they submit patches back. And to sites that are really high profile and develop their community well in the right way, that works quite well. So an example of that would be, say, MediaWiki software behind Wikipedia. But when you make a new site, you make a site like They Work For You, it's actually the inertia, the difficulty of getting someone to download it and develop it is quite high. They have to, even if you give them a machine image, it's like, what format should the machine image be? And if they don't have the machine image, they have to set up a database, they have to install the right libraries, they've got to set up the search, they've got to download gigabytes of data and load it into the site. And that's before they can even make any code changes. And I think there's a psychological problem that when you make a code change to a website like that, it doesn't immediately change the website. Whereas if you make a code change to a desktop application, you can then start running the new shiny desktop application with the bug fixed or the new feature you wanted. So I think this is a really interesting challenge, and I'd like to see the open source community thinking more about it, and I know lots of people are thinking about it. There are some very exciting projects, like there's one called Unhosted, which is thinking about how to gain all the advantages of the web in terms of usability and access to data from everywhere, but separate the privacy from the data and in a very interesting way. So it's quite a good field. And Ala Vitelli is the best example so far of My Society getting people to contribute to code, but we're also having some similar success with the Fixed Street code as well.
Well, I mean, the stuff that you're doing with ScraperWiki is very interesting from that regard, in that there is a direct hands-on consequence of going and working on the code that is very motivating and very, very immediate.
You can immediately see it. Yeah, one of the reasons we built ScraperWiki is we realized, so this is Julian, who's one of the founders and CTO of ScraperWiki. He and I realized many years ago that writing code in a web browser makes a lot of sense. It breaks lots of these problems. So I discovered that there's this barrier to contribution that My Society had of people having to literally download and set up the development environment for a web application. And if you don't have to download and set anything up, if the environment's already configured on the server, but you can just fork it. So imagine you could just go to, I don't know, a site like Flickr and fork Flickr, the whole of Flickr and your data, and then hack away on it, and then do a pull request back to them. That would make more people contribute. And you can imagine an open source version of Flickr or an open source version of Gmail where that was the main way people contributed. And nobody's done that yet, and I think it will happen. And there are things like Cloud9 IDE, which is a very exciting open source collaborative IDE, internet coding IDE. And of course, you can see it in proprietary things like GitHub as well, where they're competing very well with open source by taking advantage of many of the kind of community aspects without the full sharing of the code. So I think, I think it's quite exciting actually. I'm hoping there'll be more projects that do stuff on the web, but in a way that's kind of has the ethics of the free software movement in it.
That's interesting. I know Mozilla were working on something similar quite recently, like a browser where you could switch from viewing the page into editing the page, just by pressing a button. That would be very cool, and I'd like to think, they'd be good at that.
Yeah, every time I see someone from Mozilla, I try and pimp unhosted to them, because I think it's a very important technology for what their goals they're trying to achieve of kind of privacy on the web. They actually wrote a Mozilla Skywriter, which has somehow merged and become what's called the ACE Cloud Editor, which is the Ajax.org Cloud Editor, which is the one of the JavaScript syntax highlighting code editors that's in the Cloud 9 IDE. So yeah, Mozilla are contributing to this area already, and they're kind of potentially one of the key players in it.
Excellent. So something that we haven't really got into yet is the licensing around ScraperWiki. So what license is it under, and why did you choose that license?
Yeah, because we should make sure we talk about both code licensing and data licensing, because they're both quite interesting.
Right, yes.
So in terms of code licensing, the ScraperWiki code base itself is licensed under the Affero GPL. And the reason for that is that we want to make sure that if other people use it, that they do contribute back. So the same kind of ideals as the GPL. And the only way of doing that on the web that's credible is like literally using the GPL would be useless. It wouldn't achieve that goal, because you can effectively ship web software that's very interactive nowadays. Feels like it's desktop software, but you're basically bypassing the rule because you're not shipping a binary. So I would personally like to see the next version of the GPL default to Affero-like clauses, because I think the web's so important. Anyone in their early 20s would just like look at a license like the GPL and go, but this makes no sense. No one ships binaries anymore. I don't understand it. So that's one thing. Then there's the licensing of the code of the scrapers themselves, where we have, for the sake of simplicity, they're licensed with the GPL. And the ones that are public. If you buy a private vault, then you can license them how you like and do what you like with them. Now, this leads on to this interesting question of open data licensing. So this is another area where the open source world has inspired a whole new, as you know, in loads of areas, open source is inspiring people to open up other things. And one of these things is data. And there's a Open Knowledge Foundation, which are a fantastic, unique organisation started in the UK by a chap called Rufus Pollock, that sort of lobby for improved, more open data. And they have an excellent thing called the Open Data License, which is sort of analogous to Creative Commons or the GPL as being a license used for data that you want to be open. One of the problems we have with ScraperWiki is lots of the data is sometimes ambiguously licensed because it's owned by a government agency. They haven't defined what license it comes out as. In the US, this isn't a problem because it tends to be default to public domain, because there's a law that says basically United States data is government data is in the public domain by default, but we don't have that in the UK. So quite a lot of scrapers will be scraping data where there's not necessarily a kind of completely understood license. So we can't, the situation is complicated, is the answer. So at the moment, what we do is similar to GitHub. We just let people you have to work out the license yourself.
Right, okay. Didn't the, I'm probably showing my ignorance here, but didn't the government come out with some kind of official open data license?
Yeah, absolutely.
What do you think about that then?
It's really good, and it's used in lots of places, and yeah, I like it, and I'd like to see it be the default. But the problem is if you ask for a specific piece of data, say you use What Do They Know to make a Freedom of Information request for a specific thing, and you get it back again, often you don't really know what the license to that specific thing is, because there isn't a default that says anything released is open data. So yeah, I'd like to see that for government data, that being the default.
Right. So I'm interested actually to hear you saying you're using Affero. My experience is that most organizations that use Affero do it because they want to scare commercial customers into buying proprietary licenses on a dual licensing basis. Is that what you're up to as well, or are you the good guys?
Well, at the moment, our revenue models are doing particular scraping, like making scrapers that are for a particular purpose that tend to stay private. So that's a different revenue model. And we're also working on this selling the vaults, which will be a more software as a service where we offer a whole solution. I think it's too early yet for me to say what the licensing effect will be for other users who have their own installs. But yes, I think it's fair to say we would like to have the option of doing a revenue model like MySQL did of selling licenses where people don't want the Affero GPL, they want to do something else with it or want to link proprietary code to it. Yeah.
Right. And when it comes to the data, is the data also something you believe that you can in some way sell on, or do you think that is the data is permanently just in ScraperWiki?
For the public data, where someone's scraped a site in public on ScraperWiki, there's no we don't make any extra claim over the data. It's got the license of whoever originally produced it. For data which someone's gathered and put in private inside of Vols, our plan would be to help them do things with it that are useful. So the ideal would be if we found places where we can make cost savings. So if multiple people want to do processing with the same data, obviously it makes sense to only do it once. And it'd be great if we could find good ways of doing that. Yeah. It's
So in order to do that business model of scaring people into buying proprietary licenses, are you going to be having a contributor agreement from community contributors?
That's a great question. And I've been reading with interest the arguments about that. Yes, I'd like to have that. We haven't got one in place at the moment, but yes.
I'd encourage you to go read my blog before you make a decision.
Yeah, you should send me the link. I should read. It's partly the real question here is about community building around the software, which isn't something we've done yet. It's mainly open source at the moment as a kind of reassurance that the platform isn't something that's going to go away and is a proprietary platform. We're not at the stage where it's a project where we have loads of contributors from lots of different places.
Right. Well, if you get a contributor agreement, I can assure you won't be in that position either.
It's difficult. One of the difficult things, like I said earlier, the web is changing open source. And what's not clear yet is if you have a service which is basically fundamentally a web service, it might not make economic sense for lots of people to run their own installs unless they're really they've got a really good reason to do so. And it's not clear yet how that will pan out in terms of the licensing situation. It's not the same as it was for MySQL, because in MySQL they weren't offering a hosted database. The default wasn't that you put all your data inside one central MySQL software as a service repository, and that's just because that's not the way people distributed software then. But now this software distribution is changing to software as a service. The equation as to what people will contribute to the code and how people edit the code and how people even get access to motivated to do that equation is changing. So I would like to see that acknowledged more in the discussions about this than it is, because it's quite interesting.
Okay, so I've got a few more kind of technical-ish questions. I know a lot of our listeners like to get very into the technical stuff, and I'm afraid Randall's not here to give you the really low-level stuff. But I do have some questions about that. I noticed that at the moment you support Ruby, Python, and PHP. Are there any plans to support more languages or drop any of those languages or any of that kind of stuff?
So right now we're doing other things to make the whole site more useful and develop users, so we can add a new language and we might get then another 20% of users, but it doesn't. There are more significant things that we need to improve first. The next language we would pick is actually JavaScript, so Node.js support, as in server-side JavaScript. And the reason for that is because everyone knows it. And because not only does everyone know it, they also know how to do scraping in it, because there's a standard Node library that replicates doing jQuery-like CSS selectors on HTML. So people already know how to kind of pull out bits of data using JavaScript. And so the advantage of doing it would be if you know .NET or you know Java or you know Haskell, you probably also know a bit of JavaScript. It opens the platform up to the most new people. We get lots of people obviously asking for Perl, which we haven't done yet. Ideally, it would be just the kind of, you could put a hash bang line at the beginning of the file and run anything you like, and we wouldn't specify, we wouldn't care.
Right. Okay. So, what's the kind of split like between the different languages? Do you have any figures for that? Do you know which is the most popular of the languages that are on there?
So we get quite a lot of Python because we've done kind of from quite culturally, we're quite sort of Python-y. But actually, other than that, it's got slightly more. It's a fairly even mix. I think that it's actually a little bit kind of doing scraping writing in PHP is like kind of scratching yourself, and I wouldn't really do it. But lots of people love doing it, like using PHP for that kind of thing. So, yeah.
Yeah, and it's well, one thing we often talk about here is PHP is so ubiquitous. It's on, every you buy a little commodity web hosting thing. Yeah, PHP is always on there. Yeah. Okay, so sorry, go on. You say something there?
Oh, I was just going to say that's one of the reasons we picked JavaScript if we were doing another one, is because if anything's going to be the commodity kind of language that people know in 10 years' time, like PHP is now in that context, then it's likely to be JavaScript, just because you kind of have to learn it anyway to write the client-side stuff, so you may as well learn it for the server-side at the same time.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. So I wanted to ask some other questions about some of the other stuff that you've done, because I noticed that you've done you worked on Tortoise CVS, or you actually created Tortoise CVS, which is still quite fun.
The original creator of Tortoise CVS. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So what is that, and then what is it?
It's a Windows GUI application, but it's open source. Oh. So it's for using CVS, which for the younger listeners who can't remember CVS, it's concurrent versioning system. And it was the first kind of non-locking version control system, really, that was in wide use. It's difficult to believe in the world of Git these days that people used to actually lock whole files to do version control, but they did. And CVS let you do it concurrently and was the first one to do merging when you both two people edited the same file remotely. And it was very kind of... Yeah, it was, I don't know, when CVS was first made? Early 90s, I would guess. It's sort of a layer on top of RCS. Anyway, so I was using it, and we decided to migrate to it at a games company called CyberLife that I work for in Cambridge, in England. This is back in 2000. And the user interface WinCVS I found really clunky. And in a chat with a chap called Ben Campbell, we realized that actually... half of the problem was that it was recreating Windows Explorer. And actually, I don't really want to recreate Windows Explorer and learn this new thing that's a bit like Explorer but has version control commands as well. I'd rather just have the version control commands inside Explorer. So I worked out that you could do a Windows shell extension. And more just because I find it really funny to mix proprietary open source things. So we had not just a Windows application, but a Windows shell extension, which really buries itself into Explorer, the heart of kind of the Windows GUI. But it was open source in the GPL and promoting an open source kind of version control system that's actually been, ultimately, that's been very disruptive. Because one of the reasons, I'd say most corporations nowadays, I'd love to see figures, but I would guess most starting new projects will be using open source version control software, often Subversion, which is a kind of descendant of CVS. And one of the reasons that could work is because the GUIs were quite good under Windows for those things. So yeah, it's... I think the most exciting thing about Tortoise CVS making it is that I stopped working on it after a couple of years, and everyone made loads of other tortoises, which was kind of really quite amazing. I remember trying to report some kind of bugs and things I thought weren't right about Tortoise Subversion early on, and then kind of just being annoyed with me. And it was then I realized, actually, this isn't mine anymore. They've got a vision for it that's kind of different and beyond my vision for it. And then they went on, now Tortoise Subversion has something like 30 million downloads. It's an enormously popular piece of software. And there's like a Tortoise Git now and so on. So it seems to sort of keep moving forward with the times.
Right, okay. So you're not the benevolent dictator of the project then?
No. Well, Tortoise CVS is maintained by a couple of people really well, and they keep improving it and doing iterations on it. But it's like... it's been transferred. There are other people working on it, which is what I love about open source, which is people can pick up the ball and run with it when it's still interesting to them.
Okay. So what actually got you interested in free software and open source then? Do you remember a first experience where you were exposed to it or something? Maybe a defining moment?
There was the first time I heard of it, it was the first time I met a proper hacker, which was at my first job in 1996. So there were people at university who were, but I didn't think of it in those terms then. And he yeah, he just did crazy shit. This was back in the days of still using DOS and Windows 3.1. And he wrote things that did like low-level network protocol stuff to control a whole room full of machines and all sorts of crazy hacks. And he loved the whole culture. He read the jargon file and all the MIT hacking stuff, and he was very into that. And it was him who introduced me to the GPL at some point. I remember being a little bit... I've always been interested in things which disrupt and make things kind of that make things more efficient, like hacks like that. And I think of the GPL as being a really brilliant legal hack. I'd like to see more legal hacks like that. And it was quite exciting to discover. And then a bit later on, it actually came about just practically as well. So at work, making game software, we found we were using more open source naturally. This is in the late 90s. And it's difficult, like no one would credit it now, but it used to be the case that there wasn't a standard image reading library that was open source. Like everyone didn't use libpng for bitmap images. And it just sounds ridiculously far-fetched now. Like obviously every company in the world now uses, every IT company uses libpng to read in bitmap images. But there was a time when that wasn't the case. And those libraries were just maturing in the late 90s, and it was just inevitable that we would use them. And I think that, and that led to us going, there was another person again who was an activist going, let's use open source. Then we wanted to do stuff on the web, and the web was already quite linked to open source. So I as a kind of activist, I've always been quite political. I liked it culturally. And then as a techie, I liked the fact it opened up new possibilities and new freedoms and
excellent. So doing stuff under the GPL and you mentioned the Affero GPL is kind of an important moral thing for you then?
Important moral thing? No, well, I don't think all software should be open source. I think some software should be proprietary. But I think it's okay. So the way I'm thinking I've been thinking about this more in terms of data recently, because that's the field that's changing most. And there's this new trend. It's hardly a trend yet because only one company's done it really, which is Nike. Amazingly, the company that makes trainers. Nike have got an open data initiative. They've actually hired Ward Cunningham, who invented the wiki, to work for them and help them open up internal company data. And some years ago, they opened up data about their factories to try and get activists to help them monitor them for abuses of the employees at the factories. And these were factories that were in their supply chain rather than ones that they necessarily controlled and owned. So they're using open data to try and control their business better, which is which I find fascinating. And what a company should do, logically, you see this, so Facebook have open sourced their data center designs because it's not a competitive advantage to them. And actually Google are behind on this because Google still think that their way they run data centers is a competitive advantage because it was 10 years ago. And they're still acting like that. And they're going to gradually fall behind because things like Hadoop and things like OpenStack will get better and better and better. And at some point, it'll just seem quaint, all the stuff inside Google. They won't be able to catch up. And Facebook are preempting this a bit by going, well, we're open sourcing Sysandra, we're open sourcing. So in terms of both software and data, there's no reason for a company not to open source everything except their competitive advantage. So it's the same thing as Google using Android I hope Android resumes being open source soon, but let's assume it is open source. The way Google are using Android is like open source as a weapon against Apple. That's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is to them it's a commodity. They don't need to make money from selling a mobile operating system, but they do need a good mobile operating system. So it's not their competitive advantage for the operating system to be proprietary, so they open it. So what would increasingly happen is it's in the selfish interests of companies like Nike. Companies like actually Microsoft have got open source code every day. They contribute to the Linux kernel. So it's in the interests of most companies to start to open things up just to reduce their costs. Facebook will hopefully get people doing innovations, efficiency savings on their data center design, and that will save them money because they'll get sold back to them or fed back to them. And as they do it selfishly for efficiency reasons or for disruption reasons, Nike want to open source information about their cotton supply chain because they're worried about that cotton supply will decrease with time because there's water shortages, and they want to have more recycling. And to get more recycling, they have to alter the whole cotton industry. And they're trying to use open data to do that disruption, to release information about their cotton supply chain so that other people can then expect it. Startups can start up innovating on it. Their competitors can go, oh, we could do this together. Or, yeah, we could change this system together. Oh, I see how that's working for you. I can do this. They can collaborate in just the same way as lots of corporations collaborate around open source software projects. So the morally, and it's not just morally, just selfishly, companies should release far more open than they do now, and they're already releasing more openly than they ever have. But there's a limit to that. There'll be a point where there's something that they're protecting in some way, and then they won't open that. And yeah, it's as a consumer, I don't particularly want to use things that are left. I'd rather everything was open source, and I pick open source things where I can, but there's a limit to that. So alas, I've got a MacBook now. I'm not running Linux as my desktop OS anymore because nobody gave me what's called a whole product solution running Linux. There was, alas, no, I couldn't go to a shop in my city and buy a Linux laptop that was supported and maintained. It would always work. And I just got fed up with doing it myself. So there's this, there's always going to be a limit where people do the natural thing because they're breaking it. So from that point of view, I wouldn't morally say everything has to be, it has to be open. If someone can make the world better doing something closed, then they should do that. But as a consumer, bloody hell, yes, you should damn well be using open. It's like the government shouldn't be buying proprietary software. Why would they do that? They've got the economic clout to insist everything's open source. They'll still get loads of people bidding for their contracts, so they may as well not lock themselves in. It's just stupid to lock themselves in. It's very it's short-termist to think you get a small cost saving for locking yourself into proprietary software. So yeah, I think. Yeah, it is moral, but it's I'm more Eric S. Raymond than Richard Stallman.
Okay.
Well, you know, there's always a meeting point between pragmatism and values, and I think I've seen that conversation you've just been engaging in there go on for a whole evening in many pubs. In fact, Francis. So I was going to drag us back to ScraperWiki, if I may.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I took a look at ScraperWiki. I was quite excited by it. I wondered if you've got any favourite scrapes in there. If there are some things that are really well worth looking at.
So there was actually one today that I've just put on the front page, which is called Flickr Camera Makers, where someone's scraping Flickr. This is an interesting example because really he's calling a Flickr API, but he scraped Flickr and built an on-running data set of which cameras are in use to take different kinds of photographs. And he's made a view on ScraperWiki. You can also write little CGI scripts on ScraperWiki that export the data. And he's made a view that shows you, that 38% are Canons and 18% are Nikons and so on. So I'm giving that one as an example. So one of the categories of scraper people make is a kind of almost selfish thing, like a very personal thing. Like they have a hobby of digital photography. So they do a scraper in order to get information about their hobby. Or I scraped some marathon results. I ran the Liverpool half marathon, and if you search for marathon on ScraperWiki, you'll find my scraper that has my results in it, where I could then that could then let me do analysis that I couldn't get from the website that the results were published on. So that's quite interesting. And Twitter scrapers are often in that category. So then there are the ones where there are really good public data projects. And my favourite of those at the moment is the Australians. So yeah, if you click to open this view there, then you'll get that up. So this is on screen is the Flickr Camera Maker usage. So this is if you scroll down a little bit, you'll see a pie chart that shows the first camera. He's done a whole page of analysis. It's quite kind of amazing. And if you follow the powered by link, you can get back to the source. One of the really good things about data, it's like one of the important things about open source is actually when it goes wrong, you can look at the source code to understand how it really works, even if you don't care about any of the other advantages of open source. I'd love to have the source code to Windows just so I could, when I was writing Tortoise CVS, have actually looked up how some of the APIs really were being implemented. And likewise, with journalism and data, it's really important people cite sources. And that's one of the sort of purposes of ScraperWiki is to make that processing kind of visible. So there's a planning project. If you search for let's see, let's try searching for planning. I think that might be the best one. There's an organisation called Open Australia, which are like a My Society type organisation in Australia. And they've got a site called planningalerts.org.au, which has Australian planning applications. And if you search for planning on ScraperWiki, you'll find lots of them around there. Things like Fairfield city development applications and Walsall planning applications and so on. So I think, no, sorry, that's a UK one, Walsall. Anyway, there's a whole bunch of separate US states and separate Australian states and Australian cities, which Open Australia have scraped, writing a different scraper for each one. And they pulled it together into one national data set of planning applications, which they've then created a website of, which lets you sign up so you can be emailed when one of ScraperWiki's founders, he had a pub down his road, which was about to be, he didn't know until he came home and it was knocked down. It was a lovely old pub in Brixton. And he was really annoyed because he was just outside the range where they send postal letters to tell people about the planning application. And he built scrapers and ScraperWiki ultimately, just so in order so that in future he wouldn't miss any of these planning applications.
Right.
And he could track planning applications in different places. So the Planning Alerts Australia people, they're a really fascinating project doing that. Yeah, I can go on all day with projects like this.
Yeah. I'm actually was going to also ask you if there was any particular scraper that had a big effect on public policy or on a particular situation, whether there was a place where you win the Mosquito that Bit Carnarvon Award for the biggest effect from the smallest activity.
Oh, I haven't seen one that's politically had that effect yet. Actually, that's a really good question. I will start to watch for it. There are good examples of that in the My Society sites. They tend to be more. So say They Work For You changed the copyright of Parliament, and What Do They Know is altering a bit how FOI law works in terms of copyright. So sometimes by doing things in the way that you think the world should be rather than the way it is, you can create disruption.
Right.
And that's slightly different from the kind of thing ScraperWiki tends to get used for. So I don't have an example like that. I've got another interesting one in terms of boldness of scope. There's a startup called Open Corporates, which is an open data startup. Expect to see lots of open data startups as people understand what it means. And their model is to gather loads of information about companies across the whole world. They want a database of every company in every jurisdiction in the world. And to do that, they're scraping, first of all, just the identifiers from the kind of company registries everywhere. And they've got dozens of scrapers on ScraperWiki. They're using it as a platform to gather those scrapers together. And what's good about it is they get local knowledge. So they can get someone in America to scrape some American ones, someone in Brazil to scrape in Portuguese, and so on. And they're finding it really valuable for that. And the interesting thing about them is actually the business model, which is you're asking about sort of contributor clauses for open source. The interesting thing now is contributor clauses for open data. And their model is to release all the data under an open data license, but if someone wants to link that data to proprietary data, then they have to then pay for a license, which sounds familiar, doesn't it?
Yeah, that sounds very familiar. Yes. So I'm also interested to hear many of the things you've said there about motivations. You seem to be somebody who believes in the pragmatism of motivation, and it seems to me that you keep on talking about people being selfish. Well, I call that self-motivation. I think it's about taking people's self-motivation. I describe open source as the synchronization of a whole set of self-interests to make some greater activity happen.
Yeah, there's this weak and annoying sense in which people sometimes go, oh, but nobody's actually moral or ethical because everyone's ultimately motivated by selfish motives, which is true, but kind of annoying. The reason I talk about that is because I think that's what creates the really powerful things. So the reason that lots of people release their code on GitHub isn't because they want to share and contribute to the world. It is that, but it's also just because it's more convenient to release it on GitHub. It's just like, where should I put it? Oh, that's a place I can put it easily. And then they get lots of sharing as a kind of side effect from that. And yeah, you can do things where you expect people to just be honorable and nice and release stuff because they're good, and we should do that, and we do that as a society, but it's always going to be smaller than things where people create a public good through something which they're much more motivated to do directly. Yeah, and that's the scratching itches thing of open source is exactly playing on that. You scratch your own itches, and then the whole community's itches become an amazing product.
Yeah, definitely. I'm afraid we're running low on time now because we could talk about this all day. But I want to quickly ask you a couple of things to kind of wrap it up for everyone. So, where's the kind of future of ScraperWiki? What have you got planned coming up in the roadmap and so on?
So we won the Knight Foundation, which are a news innovation, fund a news innovation competition in the US, which we won in the summer. So we've got about an 18-month project to do data journalism across the United States. So if anyone listening is a geek or a hacker or a data journalist, then do get in touch with ScraperWiki and tell us you're interested. Because we run these events where we get together hacks and hackers into one room and get them to work together on data to make stories and to make applications. And that's going to be really exciting. And then part of that is building on a platform. So we want to make ScraperWiki more useful. We want to make it more powerful. We want to do things that make it a better data hub. And we're doing what in the startup world is called, the kind of pivoting, changing angles, trying different things to get the optimum mix for that. So those are the two main kind of activities we're doing at the moment. We're from a business point of view, we're also working with business media publishers, so kind of trade magazines and things. So if anyone knows about those, I'd be interested in connections to them as well. So things like farming magazines and healthcare magazines, that kind of thing.
Okay, cool. And if people want to get involved, the best place for them to go is ScraperWiki. Is the ScraperWiki website, I presume?
Yeah,
to go and find out more.
You can just go and start writing scrapers or editing or forking them on the ScraperWiki website. You can also look at the ScraperWiki source code, which is on Bitbucket, because we're kind of Python-y people that we're using Mercurial and Bitbucket, which seems very, very old-fashioned now.
Yeah.
Quite funny.
Well, it's a fast-moving world in the development world, yeah.
Yeah, Bitbucket have just launched Git support, so we're wondering whether to move to that to kind of be a compromise. So yeah, have a look at the ScraperWiki source code, and there's a Google group. If you search for Google Groups and ScraperWiki, there's a public developers group. It'd be lovely if you've got questions about scraping to ask them on there. If you've got projects you want to do that involve scraping in interesting ways, then go for that as well. I'd love to see lots of engagement from people about that. Yeah.
Excellent. And we have two questions that Randall always asks every guest, and I suspect I know the answer to the first one. Perl or Python is the first question.
I actually learned Perl first. I'm going to pick Perl just to get you wrong.
Wow, okay, cool.
The reason I'm going to
Randall
pick Perl
will be pleased.
I don't actually use Perl anymore because you have, to some extent, you have to use what other people are using, and that's like an important. I'm a polyglot, but I love Larry's essay about Perl as a postmodern programming language. I just think it's brilliant. So that's what I like.
Okay, excellent. Well, Randall will be very pleased with that answer. And finally, the last question that he always asks everyone is Emacs or VI, which is your favorite?
VI? You mean VIM?
Oh, VI. Or Vim.
It's Vim. Yeah, I remember loading them both in, and this was when I first installed Linux. I was like, okay, should I learn VI or Emacs? Which should I learn? And it was the white inverse video bar at the bottom of the Emacs window. I just didn't like it.
Wow, okay. That's as good an answer as any, I suppose. Brilliant. Okay, so thank you very much, Francis, for coming on. I'm sure I'll see you around Liverpool. If I stick my head out the window, I could probably wave right now, but I won't do that. Great, so thank you for coming on and telling us about ScraperWiki.
And thank you for having me.
No problem. So, Simon, what did you think of all that? Very interesting stuff, I thought.
Absolutely. I'm a very big fan of ScraperWiki, and more particularly of all the things that My Society has done. That hacktivism that's going on through software hacks on government data and on freedom of information really is changing society. It was the My Society group that did the Prime Minister's petition website that turned into a formal mechanism to petition Parliament. It's the activity that's gone on through there that's changed copyright law around legislation. And further than that, they're also actively getting involved with the mechanisms of the Cabinet Office and government and changing the way people think about data, changing the way people think about interacting with the population. So I think it's really fascinating work. I think he's done some great work, and I think ScraperWiki in particular is very interesting. I'm going to be playing with it. It's got a very low barrier to entry.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's very true. I was interested that he said one of their key goals was to make it possible to kind of write code in your browser, which I think is, as you say, a great way of getting people involved, because a lot of people don't know what tools they need to write code or run it or anything like that. And if they can just open a text box in a browser and start typing, that's very cool. Okay, then. So I'm going to quickly wrap things up because we've rambled on for quite a long time. But I should tell you about what's coming up in future on the show. We've got next week. Aaron's going to be back with the guest project is Superfeeder. And I'm going to attempt to pronounce the guest names. It's Julien Genesto, I'm going to say. I'm assuming it's a French name. And that's on the 12th of October, which is next week. And then the week after that, we've got Jonas Leitman from Vadin. These names are really difficult for me to say, but we'll just hope that I'm getting them right. And that's on October the 19th. And then the following week, we've got Massimo Di Piero, who's going to come in and talk about Web to Pi. And that's going to be on October the 26th. And there's much more coming up. And if you want to find out what's coming up on Floss Weekly, you can do. You can go to twit.tv/floss, and you'll see a link on there to the upcoming guest spreadsheet. And you can open that up and see who we've got coming up and what's happening and plan ahead, all that kind of stuff. It's very cool. So I'm going to very quickly tell you about what I've got coming up. I'm going to be, after I finish this, in fact, I'm going to be going down to Liverpool Linux User Group, where I might even see Francis, because he lives in Liverpool, and I'll catch up with those guys. But if you are in the UK, and particularly around the Northwest, and you want to come to Liverpool Lug, you're always welcome. It's first Wednesday of every month, and if you go to livelug.org.uk, you can find out more about that. Then next week, we've got Barcamp Blackpool coming up on October the 15th, and yeah, it's a technology conference in a casino. What could possibly go wrong there? So that's going to be interesting. And then we've got another Barcamp coming up, Barcamp Liverpool, on the 18th and 19th of November. If you want to find out anything about the kind of stuff that I've been up to, such as Python conferences recently and so on, you can go to danlynch.org to find out more there, and also find links to my Twitter and Identica and so on. So I think that just about does it. So Simon, where can we find out more about what you're up to?
You can find out more than anyone could possibly bear to know about me on webmink.com, or by following me on Google+, or by following me on Twitter. If you want to meet me in person, I'm going to be at the LibreOffice conference in Paris next week. That's going to be a great conference. I hear there's over 250 people coming to that. There's a party every night, lots of good food and good cocktails. And we'll be hearing from the LibreOffice community about their progress in their new governance and in doing new releases. Don't know if you saw today, there was a new release that came out with a security fix, which is a definite must-go upgrade to anyone who's running OpenOffice.org or LibreOffice. It's worth checking out. Then excellent. I'll be in San Francisco for the OSI board meeting, and I'll be talking there with people about the governance changes at OSI. And I will be in Spain in November as well for a ForgeRock meeting. So if you're in Spain and you'd like to run into me, drop me a line through the contact form on my website.
Excellent, excellent. And it's interesting that you mentioned LibreOffice, because we just talked about it recently, last night, in fact, on Linux Outlaws, that it's just first birthday has just passed for LibreOffice, and still going strong, and it's good to see it. Absolutely.
Well, LibreOffice is it's a year old now. It's got a diverse community. I remember people saying when the LibreOffice fork happened that it wasn't going to go anywhere, that all the developers worked for Sun or now for Oracle, and that there just wouldn't be anyone sharp to work on it. And so the results are really impressive. They've changed something like 5 million lines of code in there. There's something like 250 to 300 developers working on the code. There are paid developers from Novell, from Canonical, from Red Hat, from Tata Consulting Services, and from more organizations working in there. The code has been deployed by governments in Europe and in South America, and that's all just 1 year's progress. It's quite very, very impressive. Well worth going and supporting those guys at LibreOffice.org, I think.
Definitely, definitely. And thank you very much for joining me, Simon, and asking such great questions. I knew you'd have some thoughts on open data in the UK and so on. So it's great to have you aboard.
My pleasure. It's good to see you again, Dan.
Okay, so that'll do it for this week, I think. So Aaron will be back next week to join you for another Floss Weekly, and we'll see you then. Take care.